Now let's welcome our speaker, Seamus.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Seamus. I'm an alcoholic. What a great crowd. I'm so privileged to be asked to speak here. I first came to this meeting in 1974, down from Sacramento. I used to come down like about 6 times I was here, and I was so intimidated by the crowd of people, and they all seemed to have so much sobriety, and I think I had 3 years at the time. And to start at the beginning, I'm not from around here, as you could probably tell. I am originally from the north part of the island of Ireland, which is close to the Republic of Ireland, but not in it. My parents, neither of them was alcoholic, but I was one of those kids, and I think it was our house, that I woke up every morning, and the first thing that happened, my antenna went up to read the emotional temperature of the house because of the rage factor, the anger factor. Like there was always something my father was angry about. So I think I learned at a very early age to read what other people are feeling and expecting from me. I grew up then not having a clue what I wanted, but I knew exactly what you wanted. And so when I got through with school, what we call A-levels, which is after high school, I didn't have a clue what I wanted. My mother wanted me to be a doctor. My uncle, who was a doctor, thought it was a bad idea. And I remember asking him, and he said, "I don't think you have a passion for healing." I was too squeamish, and I'd worked with him for a couple of months over in England in his practice, and I kind of didn't have any tolerance for squeezing things, you know. And so anyway, he said, "You should try something else." And at that kind of last minute, I decided I'll go to a seminary because they would take you if you could cloud a mirror, they would take you in a seminary in those days. And so I went to a seminary, which is where they train priests, in case you have never heard about this. I thought, at 17, what do you know? I thought, 7 years, something will turn up. Well, one of my character defects that my sponsor later on pointed out to me is I used to say, well, I don't have to decide that today. And I used to tell Father Joe, my sponsor, "Oh, I'm living one day at a time. I don't have to decide that today." And he said, "That's not living one day at a time. That's procrastinating one day at a time." And I procrastinated all the way through 7 years of seminary. And I got ordained a priest for the Diocese of Sacramento, California. I came out to convert the Californians or something. To what, I have no idea. But it wasn't that I was a bad kid or anything, but I lived my life numb. I was in the program about a couple of years, and this woman in a program, in a meeting in San Francisco, told my story. She said, "I was in Kmart one day, and I woke up and noticed I had 2 kids." And she said, "The last decision I had made, I was a sophomore at McClatchy High School in Sacramento." And so I was in Sacramento about 6 months when I had my Kmart moment. I'm walking around the church property one day and going, "What the hell am I doing here? How did I get here?" And the novelty of, the whole thing of the ceremonials and the dressing up and all of that stuff had worn off. And I was like, I'm supposed to be doing this for the rest of my life? And now the thing that might surprise some people is I had not started drinking. So my reaction to this Kmart moment was, I just worked harder. I taught high school. If you went to Bishop Armstrong High School, you might have had me for math around 1962 or 63. I taught religion, I taught English, I taught anything, and I worked in the parish, and I was really the busiest assistant pastor in the whole diocese of Sacramento. But the pastor of the place is this old Irishman, a nice old man, and he started worrying about me. He said, you're getting no sleep. I was wandering around the rectory at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd watched the Jack Parr show, and when it went off, you just had a pattern in those days, So I'd go to the kitchen and raid the refrigerator, and, but he said, you mustn't get more than 3 or 4 hours sleep at night. And he said, you know what? There's a bottle of Old Grandad under the kitchen sink, 100 proof Old Grandad. He said, some people find that helps them sleep. And I just okay, great. A few nights later, I'm sitting there after the Jack Parr show, and I'm thinking, I ought to try that stuff. And I poured about this much Old Grandad bourbon whiskey. Oh my God. I had no idea how stressed I was till it went away. I had no idea what normal was like until I felt normal. And I was like, shit, why didn't anybody tell me about this? And it was like, it did more for me than prayer or ordination or anything, man, I'll tell you. This much bourbon whiskey, and nobody had mentioned it to me. And so I didn't forget. So I started using it daily, just right away, and it got earlier and earlier, and why suffer till midnight? Why not start at 5? And then why not start earlier than that? I mean, these old taboos about drinking early in the day. I feel good. So I was drinking about 1/5 of Old Grandad every day within about 6 months of discovering Old Grandad. And it had no bad effect that I could find. I was sleeping, I was up, I was doing my work, I had no hangovers, nothing. My biggest problem was getting rid of empties. Priests in those days lived in a rectory. There'd be 3 or 4 of them, and usually run by an old housekeeper. This old Irish lady ran our place, and she was in everything. I mean, she did your laundry, so there was nothing secret to her, And so the only place I could hide my empties was in a steamer trunk I brought from Ireland that had a lock on it. And any day Bessie would be gone, I'd bring grocery sacks full of empties out and put them in a dumpster behind some grocery store or something. That was my biggest problem with alcohol. Some of my friends were getting worried, and I got called into the bishop's office, and he said, you're working too hard, but he said, I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to go for a doctorate degree. So instead of getting in trouble, I was actually getting this chance to be gone from Sacramento for 5 years in Washington, D.C. And I said yes. I kind of almost go, what would you like me to do then? And I just, anything to get out of Sacramento for 5 years was good. So a friend of mine, even when at a going away party they had for me, he said, if it had been ballet, you would have taken it. And he gave me a leotard and a long playing record of Swan Lake, because they all thought it was a joke, that I would be going for a doctorate in canon law. And so I went, and of course I drank even more in graduate school. They don't take roll, so I could cram for exams. And so around about 1968 in May, just as I finished up that year, I called the only priest I knew in Sacramento who was in AA. And I called him and I told him about this friend of mine who was drinking a lot and was getting very depressed. And he says, how much are you drinking? And He said, when you get to Sacramento, we'll go to an AA meeting. I said, do you think it's that bad? He said, well, you can find out for yourself. And so we went. So my first AA meeting, I think sometimes people who are new think that we all just kind of, danced into AA full of joy or something. At my first AA meeting, I met Father Joe in the parking lot, and we were going in. The meeting had already started, and I grabbed him, and I said, I just want to make one thing very clear. I'm not signing anything. And he looked at me, and this was typical of Father Joe. He looked at me very seriously, and he said, okay, don't sign anything tonight, just listen. And, like, he never argued with an alcoholic, which was like a really good lesson for me. I went there, and the thing that I loved about AA, I can't remember much of what they talked about, except they were using four-letter words and talking about spirituality. And I thought, damn, this might work. This is different. I think if they'd been too pious, I'd have run, I've done that already. But this kind of rough and ready kind of approach to spirituality with none of this I'm better than thou kind of bullshit, attitude and stuff. I loved the rough language. It was like, these people maybe know what they're talking about. And so I went to 2 meetings, and I called Father Joe, and I said, this AA isn't working. I've been drinking again. And he said, well, some people need more than that. And he took me to this place down in the Valley of the Moon in Sonoma called Truman's, or Mountain Vista Farm, it's called nowadays. But it was run by this guy, Truman, who's a big ex-banker, it scared the hell out of me. And anyway, Truman said to me, oh, Father, you probably haven't prayed much lately, have you? I says, oh, I have. He says, I think that would be news to God. He says, you've probably been getting the answering service. And I said, I don't know what you mean. And he said, God is truth. And he said, the road to God is rigorous honesty, and you haven't been honest in years. He said, and he actually had a guy come down that knew a lot about me from Sacramento, and we sat, and he told me the truth. And I sweated bullets for an hour and a half, and Truman afterwards says, you've prayed more the last hour and a half than you have in years, I'll bet. Rigorous honesty. Because I used to think rigorous honesty was me telling you what I thought. But I didn't know that I was deluded. So what I was telling you and I thought was being honest was my delusion. I was being honest as I was capable of being, but rigorous honesty meant I had to have it from somebody outside of me that wasn't suffering my delusions. And that was like a really bitter pill right off. I would like to say that that cured me or something. I stayed there for 30 days, and I went back to graduate school in the fall, and I got too busy, and I did all, I wound up actually finishing my degree, my doctorate, but I was really having trouble staying sober for more than like 6 months or so at a time. And I remember this one night I went to this meeting, and there was a guy who used to pick me up because I didn't have my car with me all the time. He was a professor of astrophysics at Georgetown University. And he used to pick me up and take me to meetings. He had 5 years sobriety, and I thought, oh my God, that's all the sobriety you could possibly have, And so we sat down one night for coffee, and he said, so what are you making of this AA? And I told him, cleaning house, the kind of stuff you mumble, to people, cleaning house and working the steps, and he says, and then what? He said, God is going to look down and go, oh, Seamus has cleaned house. I think I'll give him a gift, of sobriety. What kind of, is that how you're thinking of it? Some negotiation, transactional stuff like that? And I said, well, he said, you're making it sound like some sort of third-rate religion. And he said, don't you know about spirituality and about power? And he showed me page 45 in the big book where it says lack of power. That is our dilemma. It's not lack of holiness or goodness or any of that stuff. It's lack of power. And then it says we had to find a power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. And it says, obviously, one of the shortest sentences in the book. One word, right? Obviously. And then it says, but how are we going to get this power? And I said, well, and the next line is, well, that's exactly what this book is about. It's about power. And I was thinking it's about getting holy, about getting to heaven, saving my soul. He said, no, it's about saving your ass. And he said, this is about power. And I said, well, I'm not sure I get it. And he said, well, let me put it this way. He said, it's more like physics than theology. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you were a good skier and you got good ski equipment and you're in like 3 feet of snow, 6 feet of snow, and you're in a cornfield in Iowa, what's missing? I finally got it. Mountains? And what do you get from mountains? Gravity. So how do you get power? You put your will into harmony with a power greater than you called gravity, and you're moving, right? He said, I love to sail. He had a little boat over in the Chesapeake Bay. And he said, I just love it when I put about. And he said, and I got the wind at my back and I hear my spinnaker crack open. And he said, and I got power because I'm running with a power greater than me. I don't see it. I just know what it does. He said, well, AA is like that. And then I found out that it's in page 40 of the 12 and 12 where it says our whole problem had been the misuse of willpower. Instead of trying to bombard our problems with it, what does it say? It said, we bring our will into agreement with the will of a higher power. And it says, and to make this increasingly possible is the purpose of AA's 12 steps. He said, it's more like physics. You go with the power, you got power. And it was like, oh my God, I never understood that at all. But you'd think that might have like woken me up, and I go, oh, that's the golden key, No, I still got drunk. And so I wound up like back in Sacramento with a doctorate and promoted, and then got a high responsibility job in Sacramento diocese, and I'm kind of a big shot. And the next thing I drink and try to commit suicide. And that's kind of telling me, maybe this isn't what I need to be doing. And so I went to Sacramento Recovery House. Now, Sacramento Recovery House was run by this guy, Walter McCusker. Walter, his card said, Walter from Philadelphia, I solve problems. He had been a hitman for the mob, and he had done 2 terms in San Quentin and 1 in Folsom, where they said the 3-time losers in Folsom. And so Walter got sober in Folsom, and he was running Sacramento Recovery House. He's about 15 years sober. He's the toughest old mean SOB you've ever met. I mean, I thought. But that was a kind of a gruff outer part. But so I went through Walter's. He said, you can come in here if you do what I tell you. And I said, I'll do anything, And you don't want to piss Walter off. But one night, after I'd gotten out of the recovery house, I made this commitment to go back every Monday night for a meeting. And one night, he threw out the topic. He said, I want you to talk about the insanity of alcoholism. And we were all like, oh, that's a great topic. I got really crazy shit I want to talk about. I got stuff that I did that was really nuts, and everybody's just sharing their really nutty things they did. And I just got through sharing mine about getting my Ford Galaxy 500 wedged on the Western Pacific Railway tracks at midnight. I wouldn't move back or forth, anything. I had to get a tow truck with a lift that would hoist it up. And I just got through telling my crazy story, and Walter stands up and he bangs the kitchen chair on the floor, and he said, "For Christ's sake, will somebody talk about the insanity of alcoholism? And shut up about how goofy you were when you were drunk." And he walked out of the room. And we're all looking at each other. We didn't get it. We looked at each other and go, "What's wrong with Walter?" And so, being a good priest, a few days later, I go back around the recovery house, and like go in and I say, I've got the collar on, and like, "How are you feeling today, Walter?" And he looks up from his chair and he said, "You stupid son of a bitch, you still don't know what we're talking about, do you?" He had no respect at all. He was raised Catholic. Maybe that's why. But anyway, so I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You don't know what we mean by powerless over alcohol." And I went on, I said, "Yes, I do." I said, "After that first drink and the phenomenon of craving," and he said, "Do you know what the phenomenon of craving was known about? King Solomon knew it, 700 BC. He said, "You think the phenomenon of craving is a new thing? You think that's what AA came up with?" He said, "Lay's potato chips knew that. Remember that? Bet you can't eat just one. The phenomenon of craving sets in. And this is not the secret of Alcoholics Anonymous." And I said, "Well, that's what I hear." He said, "That's what you allow in." And he said, "Do you still carry your big book?" And I said, "Yeah." And he used to kid me always about, I had this big book that had all these neon highlighters, purple and green and red and pink and all that. And he says, "Open it up at page 35 and tell me what you have underlined." And I do. And I said, "I have nothing on 35. I got stuff on 34. And he said, "Hey, smart guy, would you read the first lines of page 35? And it's why I remember. I don't remember many numbers, but I remember that. And it says, "So we shall describe some of the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking, for obviously this is the crux of the problem." He said, "Didn't you think the crux of the problem might deserve a little highlight?" And I had to tell him, I said, "I never saw that before." He said, "That's how denial works. You filter out stuff that you disagree with or you don't want to let in, and you only let in through the filter the stuff that you already agree with. So you learn zero, right? You can listen to talks, you can read books, and learn zero because you only let in the stuff you already agree with. And you shut out the stuff that's new or you don't agree with it." And he said, and then he took me through that whole third chapter, where it just talks about time after time. There's the guy, who they CPA. I love his story. Everything was going great. His business came off well. He was feeling fine. No problems or worries. It was the end of a perfect day. Not a cloud on the horizon. You see, you could never make a movie out of that. There's no backstory, right? Because then what happens next? He crossed the threshold of the dining room. Suddenly the thought crossed my mind. And then it says that we have strange mental blank spots. Well, now, I was a therapist as well. I a licensed psychotherapist, so I knew what they meant by that. That's a cognitive failure. So a cognitive failure means that, and Walter is like trying to get this through to me, and he reads page 43, the bottom of the page, once more the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink, and all of that stuff. And he says, "I looked at you when I got finished, and all I could think of was one of those old Coke machines where you put the quarters in, and nothing happens." You've had that happen, no can rolls out, right? And he said, if you'd been a Coke machine, I'd have thumped you with my fist. But what he did instead was this. He said, I'm going to take you through. He said, I knew that if I didn't get this through to you, you would die of this illness. Because you don't understand what powerlessness is. And your mind will not let it in. So what he did was this. He said, your last relapse, you were in St. Anne's Rectory, south of Meadowview Road in Sacramento, right? You'd had nothing to drink, no drugs for 7.5 months. Right. You get in your car and you drive 2 miles up to Hollywood Bottle Shop and you buy a bottle. Is there any alcohol in you driving up Freeport Boulevard? No, not for 7.5 months. You buy the bottle, you get in your car, and you told me you drove back 2 miles to St. Anne's again. Is there any alcohol or drugs in you driving back? No, not for 7.5 months. And then he did this with his coffee cup. And he said, you pour some in a glass, and even when it's up here, he said, is there any alcohol or drugs in you? No, not for 7.5 months. And then he took a drink. He said, for 3 years, all we've heard from you is, I was fine until that chemical got into me. He said, if you don't know that the insanity is what caused the relapse, he said, you ought to find a chapter of Morons Anonymous if you still think that you only got off after you had the first drink. And it was like, I told him, I said, Walter, you're scaring the hell out of me. And he said, well, you know, if you understood what I said, you'd be scared. If you didn't understand it, you're not scared. Because it's a very scary thing. I said, you mean that walking out of here 3 months sober, I might just, and he said, yeah, fall through a hole in your brain. That's what insanity is. It's like epilepsy. It just, I was so annoyed at him, I called Father Joe, my sponsor. And I said, and I told him what Walter had told me, and I said, he scared the hell out of me. And he said, well, thank God, we've all been trying to tell you that for 3 years. And he said, we were worried that you were never going to get it. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, what do you think the spiritual program is for? And I was like, oh. You see, and I put it together with what the guy had told me in Washington about how do you get power. And it was like, oh, that's what they're talking about. I am powerless. I have no power to prevent this hole in my brain, but I can get power by putting my will into agreement with the will of a power greater than me. And it was like suddenly it kind of all fell into place. And I remember Father Joe told me, he said, you know, he pointed out page 25 in the big book, it talks about this, it says, we had nothing less than deep and effective spiritual experiences which revolutionized our whole attitude toward life, toward our fellows and God's universe. Revolution is an overthrow of what you have before. I thought I only needed to tweak my religion a little bit. I didn't know I needed to have an absolute overthrow of my old ideas. And I got them gradually from Father Joe and some other old-timers in the program. They explained that spirituality is a view of our life here where every single one of us is an embodiment, an expression of the one great creative force in the universe. And it is all, you know, we're all embodiments of that. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in 1835, addressing Harvard Divinity School, says, God incarnates himself in each one of us and goes forth in us each day to take possession of his world. That's a very different thing from me down here having a negotiation with some being up here. And it's a part of theology I had forgotten, which is called immanence, that God is in everything and everything is an expression of God. And I had completely lost that concept of spirituality through religion. And it was an amazing change for me to begin to see myself and every single one of us as an expression of this one great creative force in the universe that all life comes from. And so back for a minute to Truman's, the first place I went to treatment. I really got a lot out of Truman's, and I got it the first day. I was one of these alcoholics who had the shakes. You ever have the shakes? So one of the things, if you have the shakes, you never eat soup in public, right? And so the first day that I'm in treatment, guess what they have for lunch? And there's like 17 people all sitting at this table with Truman at the end. And they took me in, I'm like a horse with blinders on, I sit down in my place, I'm not looking at anybody, and they put soup in front of me. And I am not going to touch that soup in front of 17 people, 16 other people. And Truman says, Seamus, eat your soup. and I said, I don't want to eat your soup. And so the guy on my right said the rudest thing anybody ever said to me. He said, you got a pretty good shake there, haven't you? And then the next thing he said introduced me to the fellowship. He said, mine is almost gone. It was worse than yours yesterday. And the guy on the other side of me said, mine's almost gone too. And then he pointed across the table. You see that old fart over there? And there's this old guy who's brown as a berry with one tooth, and he said he's been here a month and he's still putting it in his ear, and he was, he's grinning and spilling it, and I suddenly had the realization that I'm like a Martian that has found a colony of his own people, a place where you can connect to people at a level that I never connected to anybody before. One of the things about being in a wonderful group like this here is, when I say I'm an alcoholic, every single one of you knows more about me than my family knows about me. Because you know what it feels like inside to have that desperation. And also, we went out after lunch and we're all sitting around, we're talking and sharing stories about lying and about, stealing from people's medicine cabinets and all of this kind of stuff that we all, you have to check out the medicine cabinet when you invite Father over for dinner, he's going to check your medicine cabinet, and so anyway, that introduced me to this wonderful fellowship that has saved my soul and my ass for 53 years today is my anniversary. So thank you so much. I believe it's time for questions. So, okay. Oh, we have. Yes.
Thank you for that extraordinary talk. I'm just curious, because we didn't hear much about your life after you got sober. Are you still a priest?
No, I should have mentioned that. I'm married 52 years. Yeah, I left almost right away after I got sober. Within a year. I used to tell my sponsor, Father Joe, I'd say, I can't make any changes for the first year. And he said, if you don't make some changes, you'll never get a year. And yeah, so we've been married for 52 years. I still have great fun together, and she's not an alcoholic, and she puts up with all my BS, so it's great. Yes. He could have been, I think it was Will, was his first name. Will? Yeah.
How well did you know?
Huh?
How well did you get to know?
I met him, that would have been in 1969 or 1970. I don't know if would that be the timeline of somebody you know? Yeah. And he was a really nice character, and he seemed to have good sobriety. I hope he stayed sober. I got my doctorate that year, and then I came back to Sacramento and tried to kill myself. Well, I think I saw that life stretching out ahead. Now there was no more chance of another 5 years in Washington, D.C. I was going to be showing up at the Chancery office every day for the next umpteen years. So yes.
Thank you very much. What was your experience with the inventory, the fourth and fifth step line?
Oh, first of all, pardon? Oh, yes. What was my experience with the fourth or fifth step, right? Step 4, I kept messing around with different systems for long enough until finally Father Joe said, we got to pick one. And so he had me do, the first time he had me do the 7 deadly sins, because he said, you need to get this started. And so then we went on from that, and he worked with me past that, and we got into the column work and stuff. I did my 5th step riding around in his Oldsmobile around Sacramento, and I was so scared he was going to have me get out and walk, that he put me out of the car for some of the things I had to tell him, and he was like just really cool. He told me some things that shocked me, and he had been a priest in Chicago and been kicked out for drinking, and had been married and then got divorced and then went back being a priest. So it was kind of hard to shock Joe. And anyway, but the greatest thing that happened to me, I was expecting this, kind of euphoria after my 5th step. And the greatest thing happened was Father Joe said to me, after hearing all of this shit, he said, do you have time for a cup of coffee? We could get a piece of pie at Eppie's, And we went in, had a coffee and a piece of pie, and as we're sitting there, he said, so how do you feel now that you've done this? And I had to really think about it, because I think I was expecting a high of some sort, and all I felt was relief. And he said, and now what is that like? I said, I feel very ordinary. And he said, how is ordinary? I said, it's a relief. He said, you talk like you had to come down to ordinary. He said, we're coming up to ordinary. He said, ordinary's the top. And I think he was the one that said to me at a later date, he said, if you've ever been in a farmyard and you see a flock of ducks, the stupidest looking duck is the one that has attitude and thinks they're a special duck, So ordinary is the top, right? And I've changed the meaning for myself of that word. It's just really cool to be ordinary. Is that, yeah, that's, yeah.
For your first year of sobriety, how long did you start feeling good?
When my first year in sobriety,
Yeah, how long did it take for you to start feeling that?
until I started feeling good. Oh, I'll tell you, I started feeling good almost right away, because I didn't have Once I got detoxed, I didn't have the phenomenon of craving after that. And compared to the 6 months beforehand, my first 6 months of sobriety was euphoric. I could not believe I was sleeping, I was eating, I didn't have despair, I didn't have terror and panic attacks, and all of that shit all went away. I used to some nights be so afraid to close my eyes because I felt I would lose my mind if I closed my eyes. I was so near the brink, and that's what, like, finally I attempted suicide. And I really seriously attempted suicide. It was the car's fault that it didn't work. I took everything I could think of, and I went out to the garage in the rectory. There's like 5-car garage, and I put the big vacuum hose, you know, that's a plug-in vacuum hose in the house, and I put that into in the back window of the car and everything, and I laid down in the front seat, the big bench seat in the car in those days, and I went to sleep with the car running. And I woke up, and it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the car must have stopped sometime after I went to sleep. And my head was full of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and whatnot, and I hit the button that opened the door of the garage, and my period of sobriety, this period of sobriety began sitting out in the playing field behind St. Anne's Rectory, behind the church, the school, at 4 o'clock in the morning in the south part of Sacramento, listening to frogs. The frogs is the thing that still sticks in my mind. The frogs were so noisy, and I'm sitting there on the grass, and it's colder than hell, and I didn't mind. And I decided that if I had actually killed myself, I wouldn't care what anybody thought. I wonder if I could live and not care what everybody thought. I was terrorized by what people might think, and that, I mean, I don't recommend it, but it had a kind of a healthy outcome for me in that it cleared away all of that shit. Like, I didn't, people's opinions of me had terrorized my life. It's probably why I became a priest even, And so, does that answer you? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. For me, I'm a control freak. And when I'm trying to control, I'm full of anxiety. So if I notice my anxiety, it means I'm playing God. And so, and for me, that was like a really big thing. For the longest time, I took step 3, and thought, yeah, make a decision to turn my will and my life over, first of all, Father Joe had to pull me up one day, and he said, I had been speaking at a meeting, and I kept saying, with the help of God. And he said, it was nice of you to give credit to the little people. He said, you speak like God is your caddy or something, and you had a great round of golf with the help of my caddy. And he directed me back to page 60 in the big book, where it talks about, you make a decision, step 3, and it says, but the first requirement, in order to make it, the first requirement is we become convinced that any life based on self-will can hardly be a success. And it goes on and talks about self-will even when it's intending good shit. It's not that you're self-indulgent and hedonistic and all of this kind of stuff. No, it's like, as long as it's my plan, I'm going to be in charge of it, right? So The thing I like then is when it says that kind of, self-sufficient, self-reliant, right? These are the kinds of things that I was raised thinking you had to be. I thought God helped those who helped themselves. He was kind of a supervisor, that I didn't think he played an active role in this stuff. He thought he just kind of oversaw the whole thing. So, but no, I mean, spirituality for me was like, I had to realize that there's a great Greek author called Nikos Kazantzakis, some of you may know. He wrote Zorba, but he wrote a lot of other great stuff. And he says, I have to get out of the way so the God in me can do his work in the world. And I just think that's such a total statement of the program. Build with me and do with me. Not what I want. And I think it's around there somewhere. In fact, it even says in the 12 and 12, around page 72, it even talks about it. And this hit me because it says, you can even have sincere religious faith, which will remain barren so long as you are trying to play God yourself. And it even says we treat God as a bush league pinch hitter that we call in when we need a little help. And it says it doesn't work that way at all. So I think that for me, I have to, it's about faith, but it's also about humility. It's about knowing, a lot of people, have great faith. I had great faith, but I was playing God. I didn't have the humility of knowing that I am just one of the expressions of this one great creative force or energy that is expressing itself in all life, including me, right? So once I see it that way, then I can kind of relax and go, God is everything. Otherwise, God is nothing. He's not a helper, And the other thing I kind of sometimes talk about is I wake up in the morning, and if you've ever had an old radio that drifts off the station, I wake up in the morning and often my radio has drifted off the station. And I have to take it back and remember who I am and where I am and that I'm not in charge. I just work around here. I'm not in management. And I think once I get out of management, I think God comes into your life. But as long as I'm in management, he'll let me manage. It seems to be that way. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you so much. How does your background apply to prayer and meditation? And do you have a meditation practice?
How does prayer and meditation enter into my practice, given my background with religion, priesthood, all of that stuff? It probably didn't help much, actually, because I went through theology thinking that if I understood it, I believed it. It's a very easy mistake. If you pass your exams and you get A's, you think you must believe it. And, but I found that for me, I think I have to, I got a little mantra early on from a very wise person who said, the best, because my sponsor used to tell me, Seamus, stop telling God who he is. Because I would God is this, God is that, God, all of that. Stop telling him who he is. You don't have to tell gravity who he is, Gravity knows who he is, doesn't care what you call it, So for me, I think I had to set aside my present understandings and tolerate the anxiety of not knowing long enough to experience and come to know in a more adequate way. And then rinse and repeat all the time. You can't ever let an answer become a box that you're stuck in. So it doesn't matter what answers you thought you got last week. Set aside my present understandings and go again out beyond my ability to understand. And I find that for me, the best practice of meditation is actually to sit and know that I am known. Just that one phrase. It's a very old, from a cardinal in Belgium, actually. I got it years and years ago. I didn't meet him. He wrote about it. And I found that that one actually triggered me into like blanking my mind almost right away. To sit and know that I am known. Any of my descriptions are less than what is. So just cut out my attempt to know. And to sit with that. I usually also introduce my meditation with a period of reading something spiritual, which actually helps me to focus my mind. And those are the two things. But I don't think being a priest really helped or hurt. Probably didn't. I know people who have never had any of that, who like are really, wonderful meditators and stuff. So.